Well, I admire you guys and ladies for hanging in there to the end. It's been a long couple of days for some of us, some of you, and this is a topic that is dear to my own heart. Actually, some of my story is that when I was 15 years old, I noticed Caroline in high school. I sent her flowers on her 16th birthday, and then she wouldn't talk to me after that. 2 years later, I tried again, and here I am. But so I've had my own experience in marriage and courtship. What I want to do is, first of all, kind of talking about finding a spouse, and then I want to go through some principles for being ready for marriage. And so it'll be kind of in two sections. Just from the counseling we do, we see, as Dr. Ayers mentioned yesterday, the problem of fornication and cohabiting has spread to the church, and I think that's the biggest area that we need to be concerned about. I know we're concerned about the LGBTQ thing. Most of us are being affected by family members who are not in the church any longer into that, but I've been shocked how much of the fornication has gone on for people in the church, and we need to help them to understand very clearly what the Bible says about these things. Another kind of thing I've seen in general, and this was a lot of discussion in the last session, is that on the one hand, people want to get married when they're young, in one sense, especially Christian people who don't want to engage in sin. But I just see all these young men who are far from being ready. And a lot of our job as leaders, fathers, is to try to get these guys ready, get them away from porn, get them to limit their use of video games, get them to get to the point where they can support a family and have a vocation. And you have young men who are in their late 20s or even to their early 30s who haven't yet gotten to a place where they can care for a family. And then I've observed, I think, more young women who are in a sense ready for marriage, but they have a hard time finding somebody, and then they often settle. A book I would commend, and I would buy these by the case actually, Deepak Reju has written a book called She's Got the Wrong Guy, and it goes through all the different guys for which Christian women settle and then later may regret. The angry guy, the lustful guy, the lazy guy, whatever. I think that's a wonderful resource. I could even have a guy read it, like self-evaluate by these criteria. Which of these guys might you be? So a big issue is helping people to be prepared for marriage, especially. I think also a lot of men look at marriage as kind of like, I'm going to have somebody to take care of all of my needs and someone I can have sex with, and it's all self-centered. Marriage is, if you're loving in a Christ-like way, it's not just about having this person fulfill you. It's about you finding a person you can fulfill, you can complete, and that involves sacrifice and love as you walk with Christ. And so a lot of guys have a very immature basis even for seeking marriage. A couple of other general statements about seeking marriage. Genesis 2:18 says it's not good for the man to be alone. And then the Lord says, I will make a helper suitable for him. I think there are certain myths. We grew up homeschooling community as we raised our kids, and there'd be things you'd hear like, well, if you're not ready for marriage until you're completely content being single. And my response would be, if you're completely content being single, you don't need to get married. And so there's a sense in which your loneliness and your yearning to share life with somebody is what drives you out of singleness towards marriage. Yes, you should be patient and in a sense content while you wait for God to give you that person. But it's not that, it's not an anticipation of being at perfect peace about it. Another myth, I guess, would be that if you just wait long enough, God will send somebody to you. And even to the extent, we had a young lady in a sister church where I spoke, and I was going through the book of Ruth, which I'm going to get to in a moment, and she'd been kind of raised, she's in her mid-20s, like, she just needs to wait until some guy shows up at her little bitty church, And that's how our parents told to expect it to happen. Well, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that. Then, she had like 50 people in the church. She looks around, there's one other single guy, and he is not a candidate. And actually, Caroline, now she is married, actually. She went outside the circle of her church, and the Lord provided somebody. So I think another aspect would be initiative is okay. Initiative can be a good thing. A large percentage of the people who get married this day and age meet their person they're marrying online somehow. Now, I can't say from the Bible that's wrong. I can say that there are risks involved, and those risks need to be mitigated. In the past, like even Carol and I, we grew up in the same community. We knew each other for years before we got serious. Not my question, but her desire in that regard. But the difficulty is if someone is a face on a profile and they live 1,000 miles away, you don't really know that person in the context of community. Now, I think that can be overcome as concrete example. I've had cases where a young lady in our church a guy was showing interest that they met, whatever, Reform singles online or something. But then I would talk to the pastor and say, tell me about this guy who's in your church. Well, the pastor doesn't know the guy, that's a red flag. Or I've got reports where actually I think he's a Christian, but they would be honest and say, here's some concerns I have. Then I could share with the young lady, it's up to you, but here's what I found out. Or talk to the guy and maybe ask some of the tough questions of him. So I think it requires more investigation, and so we need to be really, really, really careful in those situations. I enjoy the book of Ruth. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. Nate talked this morning about how things happen in the Bible, sometimes without commentary, and you have to kind of bring principles from elsewhere in Scripture to interpret what's going on. One of the most unusual scenes in not just the book of Ruth, but maybe the entire Bible is when Naomi, the mother-in-law, sends Ruth to go lie at the feet of Boaz in the threshing floor to make an appeal that he would marry her. And thus, it's on the Old Covenant Levirate marriage where a near relative marries a woman, a widow, so that they can produce children that would actually be legally of the man who died, the first husband. And so the context, we don't have that now. But there's some principles there that I really do appreciate. One would be, what attracted Boaz and Ruth to one another? Well, when Ruth comes, in verse 11 of chapter 3, it says, now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And it's similar language that's used in chapter 2 of Boaz. He was a man of excellence. My wife will point out in Proverbs 31, there's no physical description other than she has strong arms. And same, I think Ruth had strong arms too. She's carrying, heavy weights of grain in chapter 2. But it's character. Charm is deceitful. Beauty is vain. A woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. And so I think the primary consideration we should have would be the character of the person. I think you should be attracted to the person you marry. But sometimes people with wonderful character may have an attractiveness that grows on you that the world wouldn't necessarily say is the most attractive person. Another comment I'll make about finding someone is, and it can sound crass to some people, but I look upon choosing a marriage partner as being kind of the ultimate economic transaction, meaning that you come into the situation with certain assets, and we're all trying to get the best we can. And part of it is, if you're coming into it with whatever you've got going for you, then you're trying to do great. Some guys are unrealistic, like he's a 5 and he's only going after people who are 9s. Or he wants 9 for outward appearance and he doesn't care that much about character. And so, by the way, another aspect would be, if you're a 4 or a 5, try to increase your number. What I mean is, stop looking at porn, get a career, get a job, grow spiritually, serve the Lord, so you would be if a Ruth comes along, she'd be attracted to you as a Boaz or vice versa. Become the person that the person you want to marry would want to marry. So, and that's a lovely aspect of the case of Ruth and Boaz. Another thing that I like in this passage is that when Ruth comes to Boaz and she's appealing to him to spread his covering over her, to care for her in marriage and to produce a child that would carry on the family name, Boaz, there's a complication in the drama. And that is that after he says, "You're a woman of excellence," now it is true I am a close relative, however, there is a relative closer than I. And this is part of what's really good about Boaz's character. And that is that he respects the rights of others when it comes to courtship. In this case, that there was a closer relative who had right of first refusal. And Boaz very cleverly gets the guy out of the game in chapter 4. But he respects the right of that. He doesn't just take Ruth there or take her as a wife, but he honors Ruth, keeps her pure, because this other guy may have a right to have her. So, well, how does that apply to us now? A friend of mine, when I was 18, gave me the advice that when you go out with a girl, keep in mind that one day she may be your best friend's wife. That we need to respect, if you're not married to somebody and you're in a dating, courtship, whatever relationship, respect the fact they may one day be married to somebody else, and don't take from them what belongs to somebody in the future. Respect the rights of a future spouse. Another way my friend put it was that treat the woman you're out with tonight the way you hope the guy who's out with your future wife is treating her tonight. But I think Boaz exemplifies that as well. Another principle from the book of Ruth, we already talked about taking initiative, which again, Naomi's methodology of taking initiative, I have real questions over, but the general idea of making an appeal I thought was fine. Another aspect would be that if God can provide a husband for a Moabite widow who never was able to have children, Ruth is not the most attractive candidate from the standpoint of bearing children. She was married, never had kids. She's from a foreign country, yet God provided a Boaz in the days of the judges when there are not many Boazes around in those days. And so I think there's hope for those who are lonely to pray that God will send you a Boaz or a female version, and to pursue, to seek, but there is hope in that regard. In terms of pre-engagement, Tim Challies, who writes blogs, has taken part of my book where it's 10 issues to work through before you get engaged. I'm not going to go through those today. It's not my main thing. But one thing I will say is that as couples are seeking, courtship, and they're trying to decide whether they want to pursue marriage, one thing I think that needs to be covered fairly early on is what I would call the deal killers. A deal killer would be, we had a case where a man was fluent in Spanish and wanted to be a missionary. And as they were courting, the woman realized, I don't want to be more than 5 miles from where my mother lives. And that ended it. And you're free to end it. I mean, you may question judgment of some time, but they have the freedom to do that. Other issues would be pornography. What is this person bringing? Most guys and many women now have struggled with that to some degree, but I think there needs to be kind of honesty about where that struggle is, and then the other person, knowing the truth, has a right to decide, I'm willing to continue or I'm not willing to continue. Likewise with the sexual past. And so the big deal killer that, should be a deal killer now that's come up a lot, I think it's the influence of culture, is we've had these cases where couples have been married 3 or 4 years and they can't agree whether or not to have kids. Thinking, who did your pre-marriage counseling? That wasn't resolved first. And just, for many of us who are a little older, like the idea of not having kids was just bizarre. But we're living in a day now where in the United States, we're way below replacement rate for the number of kids people are having. More and more women are just saying, I never want to have kids. And of course, there are places in the world where they're like way less than half of replacement rate. It's a bizarre demographic that's happening. So I think that's another kind of issue, is working that one through. And my own view would be, I would be quite concerned if someone says, I want to be married, but I never want to have kids, unless there's some issue of age or medical condition. I think it would be the influence of the world. Another thing, which the part on the title about Pinterest ceremonies, another general statement I would make is that I've been kind of, and these are opinions, okay? But I've seen people that want to have the perfect wedding, and they'll wait a year or more to get the venue they want, and to have, we're going to save money for 2 years so we can have this perfect wedding. Look, what you want is a marriage, not a wedding, okay? The wedding's just the beginning, and if you found the person you want to marry and you're both ready, then why are you going to spend years or months waiting? Not to mention, maybe that's not the best use of $100,000, but have a simple wedding at church, invite family and friends, make it a potluck if you have no money. That's my opinion. Rather than some people, it's waiting until they've saved all this money and they can afford a house. Again, you're free to do that, but it's hard once you've found the person you want to marry. It's hard to behave while you're anticipating marriage. And by the way, marriage is just so great. Why would you wait? We were 21. My only regret was we didn't get married sooner. So those are some general statements. There may be questions about finding someone to marry. Now I want to talk about pre-marriage counseling, and I'll give a couple resources. What Carol and I typically do in pre-marriage counseling is we meet with a couple 5 to 7 times. I have a kind of a list of assignments and topics for each of those weeks. It follows pretty closely with the early chapters of my book on marriage. The main resource in addition to my book that we use is Rob Greene's book called Tying the Knot Tighter, which some of you are nodding, you're aware of that book. I think it's really excellent in that it's gospel focused in terms of seeing marriage in light of the gospel. It is also brief enough that it's manageable. The book I used to use I really liked, but the problem was nobody ever finished it. It was so exhausting. And so I think it's a great resource for that. Now, what I want to focus on for the rest of our time before there are questions is the premarital foundation of keys to preserving and strengthening marriage. And the perspective Carol and I have is we do a lot of marriage counseling. Often couples come in with very troubled marriages. And sometimes I even think, could you bring a wedding photo to the first session? You were so happy. What happened that now you're so miserable together? I'm glad we'll often try to, give hope. You're here. That's good. The Lord can help you. But some marriages are in horrible shape. And in our culture right now, we see the denigration in marriage. We see homosexual marriage. We see, people living together without being married. We have all these horrible examples. And I know some Christians may have a sense of calling to try to make the laws better. Odds may be against you right now. I think the best thing we can do to promote biblical marriage is to have biblical marriages. As the world is more and more dark, our marriages should be more and more light. And the way this part of the talk came together is actually some years ago, I was going to speak in a marriage conference, and the organizer asked me, okay, you've been married over 40 years. You've been doing marriage counseling most of that time. What are some of the most important things you've learned about what makes a marriage successful or what can cause a marriage to fall apart? And so I have 6 aspects for preserving and strengthening marriage, and they all have the letter L in them. I've only done alliteration 4 times in my entire life, maybe 3, but this is one that it seemed to work. Didn't have to stretch it too far. So what I want to do is go through these 6 L's. And the first is that the Lord must come first, even ahead of your spouse. That your vertical relationship with the Lord is the foundation for your horizontal relationship with your spouse. And, marriage takes a lot of grace. It can be hard. We're selfish sinners. You'll often hear people say not long after marriage, I never realized what a sinner I am. I never realized how selfish I am. Or they may say, I never knew what a sinner she was until we were married. And the only way we can really endure in marriage is to be personally strengthened by the Word of God and the Spirit of God. We have to be walking in the Spirit to be able to bring forth the love that God expects of us. Often when couples come to us with a troubled marriage, we'll ask, well, individually, how is your own walk with the Lord? Are you spending time in the Word? Are you regularly in prayer? Do you feel like you're walking in the Spirit? And almost inevitably, when the marriage is deeply troubled, they will say, well, no. Now, that can make sense. 1 Peter 3:7 says that if a husband does not treat his wife with respect, his prayers will be hindered. But as couples are in difficult marriages, I mean, you don't want to be making major life decisions when you yourself aren't walking with the Lord as you should be. I would also say that if your marriage is in trouble, the first and best thing you can do is for you to strengthen yourself spiritually in terms of your own walk with God, that the Lord can help you deal with things. Peter says, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the Word, so that by it you may grow with respect to salvation. And one aspect of this is that I have worn my little badge today. It says, don't follow your heart. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful, desperately wicked, who can understand it? My wife likes Disney movies. My wife likes these Hallmark movies. It's always follow your heart, and it doesn't always work out. But part of the problem with romance movies and novels is that the idea is that if you just find the right person, that's going to fill your love cup. They'll speak your love language or whatever, and that's the key to happiness in life. And I believe that if you're looking to a spouse to meet needs that only God can meet, you're going to have trouble in marriage. That our love cup, or however you want to put it, our gas tank or whatever, is first and primarily filled in our relationship with God, because as you are a sinner marrying a sinner, they are going to let you down sometimes. And so there are big problems in marriage when one spouse can even idolize the other or their expectation. Well, if I just get married, everything's going to be great and wonderful and happy. That is unrealistic. And so, again, best thing you do for marriage, your own walk with God. Along with that also would be the importance, the Lord coming first, would be the importance of a couple being involved as members of a strong church. Hebrews 10:24, we should consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the habit of some. When we ran a biblical counseling ministry in Southern California, people would come from different church backgrounds. A lot of people would come who attended churches but weren't really joining kind of the really mega type churches with no membership. And the problem is that when they needed shepherding, they didn't have shepherds who knew them and were caring for them. Hebrews 13:17 talks about how God has appointed our leaders to keep watch over our souls as men who will give account to God for our care for people. So being in a church where you're a member, where also you're being strengthened by the means of grace. God has given the Word and the ordinances, the praise and worship of God's people coming together is something to strengthen you individually and collectively in your own spiritual life. And then likewise, when you have trouble, and if there is trouble in the marriage, you have people who know you and love you who can help you walk through those things. And so we've had families say before, I don't know what we would have done if we'd not been in a church like this, where people would help us to walk through these concerns. Another ideal is that obviously that a husband and wife, in addition to having their own individual relationship with God, would have a collective relationship with the Lord where they pray together. I will confess the first several years of our marriage that we were very inconsistent in prayer. I mean, we prayed at meals, but I'm talking then it was actually in 1990, a long time ago. The church we were in, as I finished seminary, was having a terrible crisis. And it's your job, it's your friends, it's your ministry. And we started praying together just out of desperation every night. And I'm thankful to God to say now, 30-something years later, we are still praying together. Just like some of us wouldn't be able to go to sleep without brushing our teeth. Well, we can't go to sleep without praying together. It's not this big, long, elaborate thing, but just seeking God's help for our kids, for ministry, the people we're counseling. It's a very, very sweet part of our marriage. And then a devotional life. Again, I think sometimes I was talking to a guy that was saying, yeah, we do family worship. When he described everything he did, it's not like he was planning a whole church service. And how often do you get that done? Well, not very often. And so we've been using these 31-day devotionals by P&R that are 2 pages per day on hope or fear or worry. There's several different topics. Contentment. I did one actually on finances in that series, but we found that to be a blessing. Whoever's at our table, we just read that together. So having some kind of spiritual life together. So the Lord comes first. And then next, actually, a true story, that a few years ago I was privileged to conduct the wedding of our nephew and his bride-to-be. And I chose this passage for the wedding sermon. And I realized later, this may be the first time in the history of the church that somebody ever picked this passage for a wedding homily. Here's my passage. Proverbs chapter 24, beginning in verse 30. I passed by the field of the sluggard and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles. Its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber and your want like an armed man. So my second L is laziness. That laziness will cause a marriage to deteriorate. I love the illustration in Scripture of the sluggard's field. You have farms in Illinois, we have farms in North Carolina, and sometimes we're driving out in the country and you'll see like here's a farm where there's neat row of cotton or corn and the red barn standing up, it all looks good. Then across the road, there's another, and it's a field of weeds and thorns and thistles. And maybe you can see where the rows used to be, or some crops are trying to make their way through that. What's the difference between this field and that field? They both looked the same several years ago. This one was neglected. And it's a picture of what happens to many marriages. A few years ago, a senior pastor of an influential church sent his assistant pastor and wife to Carolyn and me for counsel. And because they were having sharp division that was threatening their marriage and even his ministry. And as this appointment was set up, the young pastor who was being counseled, in order to prepare us for this meeting, sent me an email with 6 pages of his complaints against his wife. And this is pretty common in counseling where they want to use you as a stick to beat the other one with. So he went through his lengthy description. And then when we got there, his wife didn't need notes. She was able to fire pretty consistently without notes. But I had him very early in the session read this passage. And he said, that's our marriage. They've been married probably less than 10 years. And they were happy and they were drawn to each other in the beginning of the marriage. But he's all wrapped up in his ministry and she's wrapped up with the kids. And then she's overwhelmed with the kids and she's embittered because he's always doing ministry and he's tired of her nagging and there's weeds and thorns and thistles everywhere. And I've mentioned this morning the peacemaker material of, Ken Sande, yes. And we were talking earlier, like I actually keep this summary of the peacemaker material. I keep multiple copies in my Bible at all times, and I usually end up passing a couple out in a given week. But the basic principle, Matthew 7, is first get the log out of your own eye, first deal with your own sin. I think in this case, I had them read that passage and I say, okay, what does it say? Well, it says we should be more concerned about our own sin than the other person's sin. And so the rule in the first session is the only person about whose sin you can talk is your own sin. Who would like to begin? And so when a marriage has been neglected and when there have been unresolved conflicts and sin that hasn't been dealt with, it's again like the weeds have grown up and consumed it. Now, I can tell you with great thanksgiving that this couple, this young pastor and his wife, the Lord did an amazing turnaround. One thing I really appreciated, he was even willing to come to my class and share what God had done, which for a pastor is a pretty humble thing to do. That their marriage was the sluggard's field, and then as they have each dealt with their own sin, they've each have forgiven one another by grace, that things have really been transformed. There can be a risk in marriage of just taking each other for granted. This is a big risk in ministry marriages. When I worked for an oil company, I would go in at a certain time. I'd get home at 5 or 6 o'clock. I didn't really have to think about the oil company till the next day, and not at all during weekends. But ministry is different from that, right? There's always more you can do. It's like actually being a student. There's always another commentary you can read. There's always another phone call you can make, another email you can answer. It doesn't have good limits or boundaries built into it. And I think that we've seen so many cases, especially in ministry marriages, where the husband is consumed with ministry and the wife is kind of being told, if you make any demands of your husband, you're taking him away from the Lord's work, and that's kind of selfish and detrimental. And over time, I've seen where the wife becomes embittered, sometimes 20 or more years into the marriage, where she feels like, even badly about the ministry in general because of the neglect. And so in terms of the laziness, I think that it's very important that we make our relationship with each other a priority. And especially in terms of people in ministry, just like you make appointments with people to meet with them, and then you're not free during that time, to make appointments to be with your spouse. Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead to advantage, and the one who is hasty comes to poverty. I was counseling a man named Andy not long ago, and I said, well, how much time do you think you should spend with your wife, like daily, weekly, etc.? And he laid out pretty reasonably. I think we ought to talk at least 15 minutes a day. I think we ought to, maybe every week or every 2 weeks, go out on a date and talk about deeper things. Well, that's great. When's the last time you did either of those things? Well, not at all. It's not due to malice. It's like the sluggard's field. It's just neglect. And so I think to ask yourself, this is the thing going into marriage, what is your plan for being together? Since our nest is emptied, something that Caroline and I do every day when we're at home is we'll go for a walk for about an hour, and we'll talk over things we're learning. We're not staring at our phones, or that's what Caroline likes about it, is a generally phoneless hike. And I don't view that as neglecting ministry. I view that as keeping me qualified for ministry, that we invest that time together. But if you don't plan it, it will not happen. And then also, in terms of pulling the weeds, is planting the flowers. I think I quoted Ecclesiastes 9:9 already this morning, that to enjoy life with your spouse, that marriage isn't just about getting all the stuff done and resolving your conflicts, that God wants us to bring great joy to each other. And that's an investment of time to find things that your wife or your husband would love to do, and do those things together and have fun together. That's, even for those in ministry, that's part of what will keep you fit for ministry and to set an example. One other thing I will mention, which would be, if you have trouble, get help. Again, this is another issue, especially for church leaders. We do a lot of counseling with church leaders, and the thing we often hear from, Caroline will hear from the wife especially, is, I have no one else I can talk to. Pastor's wife doesn't feel comfortable telling the other leaders in the church her problems with their marriage. And there's sometimes can be a lot of loneliness for people in ministry and wives in ministry. But if you're having trouble, get help from somewhere. Oftentimes it's the wife who is willing earlier than the husband. Sometimes the husband gets kind of drug in. Actually, we have on our form, what brings you here? I say, my wife is sometimes the answer. But we kind of call it a prenup. It's not in writing. The prenup should be, when we're doing pre-marriage counseling, is that you agree in advance that if either one of you thinks you need help, then you're going to go. Because a lot of time, oh no, it's okay, the man will not engage at that level. So the third L is that lies. If laziness is kind of gradual deterioration like the sluggard's field, lies are like a cancer in a relationship. Ephesians 4:25 says, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. The visualization that Paul gives in that verse, and it's in the context of the close relationships in the church, but I think would apply in the closest of all relationships in the family and husband and wife, is that we're members of one another. And you're familiar with the picture of the members of the body together, is that You have to be able to trust all of your body parts. If you couldn't trust your eyes, you're in trouble. If you can't trust, in my case, I used to run long distances, and if I can't trust my knee not to collapse and send me down on the ground, I would probably not want to run anymore. And yet there are many marriages in which one or both parties is guilty of lying, is guilty of falsehood, guilty of evasion, or well, why do we lie? Well, we lie either to get something from other people that we don't deserve, or to avoid trouble, to get out of what was wrong. Some people are so accustomed to lying, it's almost like they have to learn a new language. And that's actually the context in Ephesians 4. It says, now that you've put off your old self when you were converted, put on the new self. Your new self should be a truth-telling self. A couple of actual stories that there was a guy, for a while in our church anyway, and he bought his wife a diamond ring. And she took the diamond ring sometime later to the jeweler, and the jeweler said, ma'am, to get cleaned, and the jeweler said, ma'am, this isn't a diamond, it's cubic zirconium. And so she came home and told her husband what the jeweler had said. Oh, what does that jeweler know? And so, give me that ring, I'll go talk to that jeweler. And so he comes back sometimes later with the ring. See, he says it is a real diamond. And the wife looks at the ring, it's obviously a different stone. And then the charge comes through on the credit card for some huge amount of money for the real one. Lying is very foolish, but it's destructive of trust. Marriage is built on trust. You begin the marriage when making promises to each other, the vows of marriage. And so if you can't trust your spouse, you've got big problems. On the other hand, we also need to make it safe for our spouse to tell us the truth. Give you a couple of examples. I was overseeing a case one time where the husband was struggling with looking at inappropriate things on the internet. And he had put some software on there to keep him accountable. Well, the wife went away for a weekend, and when she got home, the software had been disabled. And he was trying to say, oh, I don't know how that happened. And I mean, there probably was unlikely some Russian hacker got into his computer to disable his porn blocking software. Would be better just to say, I sinned, I'm guilty, I'll go talk to one of the pastors, please forgive me. But then the other side is that we need to make it safe for our spouse to tell the truth when the truth hurts. Real story, I have permission to tell this on Caroline, is that in California where you used to live, it's illegal to talk on your cell phone while you're driving. But my wife has 3 adult sons, and now she has 4 grandchildren. And so that was a hard rule for her to keep. And there was an occasion that she was at a stoplight in our town in Escondido, and she's talking on the phone to one of our kids, and a policeman rolls up on his motorcycle, and the window's open, and he goes, you're in trouble. And so she got some ticket that was quite expensive, which is the way things are in California. And again, what are her options? Well, she could try to hide that. She could try to pay it without me knowing. But in Caroline, there is no guile. I've never known her to lie. And I came home, she tells me what happens, but then how am I going to respond to this? It's an opportunity to show grace, to make it safe to tell hard truth, as opposed to a sinful response, which would make it hard to tell the truth. So we want to make it safe and easy for our spouse to tell us the truth, even if it's not what we want to hear. The next one, the fourth, is lust. And lust is like a bomb going off. It can quickly destroy your marriage. We already talked today in the morning about how sexual sin does not necessarily lead to divorce, but it can lead to divorce. And that's just an awful thing. I've had more friends than I would like to think about, including friends in ministry, who have been disqualified because of sexual sin, often with people they were doing ministry with. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, be careful if you think you stand, lest you fall. This is a real danger and a real problem. We need to be circumspect in our dealings with the opposite sex. Flee youthful lusts. And when you get married, you're making, or even engaged, you're making a promise to cut off all of the romantic options as long as you're both alive. But the issue is that getting engaged or getting married doesn't mean that you're incapable of feeling attracted to someone else. There's not some force field around you that, okay, now that I've married or I'm engaged, then I'm no longer going to be tempted to that. And so, but you're making a promise that even if you feel drawn in that direction, you're going to cut that off and see that as a danger rather than following your heart. Few Christians that plan to have an affair. People slip into these things, and we've counseled so many cases of marital infidelity. The stories vary, but I'll just give you one typical scenario where you have the mom from one family brings her kid to soccer practice, the dad from the other family brings his kid to soccer practice. And twice a week at soccer practice, they're just hanging out and talking to each other. I can't say, I'm not against talking to someone of the opposite sex, but every single week they're talking to each other. And then one week he doesn't show and she misses him. And they start talking about more and more personal things. And now you realize they're talking more to each other than they are to their own spouses. And perhaps sharing struggles in their marriage and discontent in their marriage and affirming each other. And then, one person's, their hand kind of slips past the other one squeezes back, and on it goes. And so we need to be very, very careful about especially personal intimacy with people of the opposite sex. I'm sure many of you have heard of what's called the Billy Graham rule. It's kind of fallen into hard times lately. People have been very critical of it. But from the earliest days of ministry, Billy Graham and his other workers made a commitment not to be alone with the woman, like at a restaurant or other situations, obviously other than their wives or car. And it was for two reasons. One was the realization that they were not beyond being tempted. There's also another reason, and that is that if you are alone with somebody, then they can make an accusation against you that it's very difficult, especially now in the day where you're supposed to believe all women, then that could happen as well. Now, so far as we know, this worked for them in that, they're all dead now. And as far as I know, there was no scandal among the inner circle of Billy Graham's team, in spite of the fact they traveled quite a bit, sometimes often without their families. Now, in recent days, the Billy Graham rule has come under fire. And I think, we need to be careful not to be absolutely legalistic. But the idea of setting certain standards to protect your marriage, I think, has some wisdom to it. When Vice President Pence was in office, he was getting a lot of criticism because he had rules that he would not meet absolutely alone with female staff members. There was complaints that it's keeping them from having the same opportunities as the men. Even in church ministry, there have been people who've written blogs against the Billy Graham rule, saying to the men, don't think all women are trying to seduce you, or if you can't be around a woman alone, then you shouldn't be a pastor. And I think that can be highly judgmental and a bit unfair for those of us who want to be very careful. Others have even encouraged that, men and women ought to be able to have close friendships with people they're not married to. Ironically, one pastor who was advocating that got into trouble. And you see, even if there's not a physical component, there can be an emotional connection. We talked about that some this morning too, that the emotional intimacy between a man and a woman is still something that is intruding upon the marriage itself. And this is something even unbelievers have recognized. There was an article in the New York Times some time back called The 36 Questions That Lead to Love, and it was dealing with research done starting in the 90s, where they would have pairs of men and women who would answer 36 very personal questions. They would be alone together. They would make eye contact, be fully engaged with each other. And then the psychologists, after these conversations would take place over an hour or more, they would ask, how do you feel after that? And guess what? they started feeling an attraction to each other. Working closely together with someone of the opposite sex can do that. You see this when, actors in a movie and they, have an affair, or even like there's a case of a military general who had a woman who was authoring his memoirs, and then they wound up in a relationship like that. So my view is we need to be careful. The first thing I ever had published was an article for the Journal of Biblical Counseling 30 years ago called The Tenderness Trap, just recognizing that in counseling relationships between men and women, even if you have windows, there can be a level of emotional intimacy that develops, which can be dangerous, which is why my choice is not to counsel women alone. But she can bring a friend, I can bring a friend, I can bring Caroline, whatever. That we need to be careful. Kevin DeYoung made the statement, "I don't think my wife is sitting at home thinking, I wish my husband had more close friendships with women." I think we should have friendships with people of the opposite sex other than our spouses. I just think there needs to be a care and a propriety in that, ideally including our spouse in those relationships. Again, don't go to the extreme. I think for a while I was so concerned about being careful in this area. I, as a pastor, sometimes failed to really shepherd as well as I should have the female sheep. I'm a shepherd of all the sheep, not just the men. And so I make a point now with the women in our congregation on the Lord's Day to talk, to pray, as I would with the men. But I would also say, I've seen this where if you're talking to the same woman every week, you probably need to reevaluate what's happening there. And then just not thinking it could happen, don't think it couldn't happen to you after what we see with King David. We need to watch over our hearts. And I think a husband and a wife just need to have an agreement about what are we going to do to keep our marriage safe, and then accountability. But my wife and I, we have certain rules, and we can sometimes by mutual agreement suspend a rule. Like we have a rule, not alone in a car with someone of the opposite sex, but if I'm giving a ride home to a visitor from campus 10 minutes to our house, is it okay if I give her a ride home? And so there can be some exceptions to that level. So the next one is more positive, and that is to lift one another up. And I'm going to talk in the last 2 points about 2 books that have had a major impact in my life. And in this one, I'm going to talk about Practicing Affirmation by Sam Crabtree. Sam he worked for years with John Piper in Minneapolis, and he's now at North Point Church, which is a plant of that church. But when I was given this book shortly after it came out, I remember being very suspicious. Practicing Affirmation. I'm a Calvinist. I believe in total depravity. And I'm a biblical counselor, and I don't believe in self-esteem, the lovers of self. But he makes a biblical case that affirming God's good work in others is right and biblical. And the most clear example would be in Proverbs 31. A very clear example in marriage is that where the husband says, many women have done well, but you surpass them all. He's praising his wife who is so devoted to the family and to serving the Lord. There are many other examples in the Bible. You have Paul writing his epistles. He affirms the good work. Even in the Corinthians, he finds something to say before he brings correction. The Revelation letters where Jesus commends what can be commended among the 7 churches. And Paul, the end of Romans, this long list of names, and he's commending that. So affirmation is biblical. It's also really important, and especially in marriage. Crabtree points out that in most romantic relationships, they begin with a whole lot of affirmation and very little criticism. And oftentimes, like this person, they like me, they want to spend time with me, they want to marry me. This is very affirming. But sadly, over time, often the affirmation diminishes and the criticism increases. And you can think of older couples I've counseled where they're sniping at each other all the time, and they're not going to divorce each other, but they're criticizing each other, correcting each other, and the affirmation is kind of diminished. Crabtree also makes the observation that affirmation is like making a deposit in the bank of relationship, and criticism is like making a withdrawal. But then he says the problem is that it takes multiple deposits to give you the right to make one withdrawal. And this isn't just with your spouse, this is with your kids. I was convicted by this book because my tendency was kind of, if you're doing it right, I don't need to say anything. That's what you're supposed to do. And if you're doing it wrong, I will correct you. When I read the book, my youngest son was just out of college, living at home, and we were sitting talking, and I made some statement, Daniel, I really appreciate such and such about you. Like, he posted it on Facebook. My dad, Jim Newheiser, just said blank. And I realized that was convicting in terms of it was such a newsworthy event that I found something to affirm. I also think we can affirm unbelievers in the sense of God's common grace, restraining sin, or common grace virtues, even if they're not yet believers. And so sometimes when I'm counseling a couple, I'll even say, okay, tell me something you most appreciate about the other person, or give me 3 things you really thank God for about the other person, because they don't have any trouble coming up with the things they don't like. And I've seen it have an effect right away where the husband said, well, I really appreciate she's a great mother. She's very careful with money. She's very devoted to the home. And she's like, I didn't know you thought any of those things, because all she's been hearing is criticism. So common homework assignment is every day find at least 1 or 2 things to affirm about your spouse and do it till one of you dies. It's not a 1-week assignment. It's a rest of marriage assignment. So lift each other up to strengthen your marriage. I'll also, back to the lust thing, I'm convinced that most affairs take place not so much because of sexual desire, but often it takes place because of lack of affirmation, where a wife is treated as dumb and lacking ability, and this is a guy I can never please, I'm never good enough for him, and then some other man comes along and flatters her, spreading a net for her feet, but she's vulnerable to that because of her husband's criticism and his lack of affirmation. And it can happen with men as well. So, and then another analogy I've used is like you see people at the beach and they've got these metal detectors and they're looking for coins or looking for rings, jewelry or something. I want to be an affirmation detector. I want to be constantly searching for things I can honestly and sincerely affirm, especially in my wife, but even in other people as well. It has an effect on people in counseling as well. They often come in hopeless, and I'm so glad you're here. You're seeking help from the Lord, and that's so great. So the last is a kind of a double L, which is love, not law. And I'm happy to be able to, somebody thought I'd said law, not love this morning. If I did, I was really tired. The point being, and this is actually from Dave Harvey's book, When Sinners Say I Do. That's also had a big impact on me. And it's just really bringing the gospel into marriage. And he begins the book with 1 Timothy 1:15, where he says, it's a trustworthy statement, deserving full acceptance. Christ Jesus came to save sinners, of whom I am foremost, of whom I am chief. And it's kind of back to the Matthew 7, get the log out of your own eye first, is that in your marriage, you need to recognize the biggest sinner you know is you. The biggest threat to your marriage is your own sin. To be humble and recognize you are a sinner. And then also to recognize you're married to a sinner. And so when Caroline sins, it shouldn't be, I can't believe you sinned. And that her sin is opportunity for you to show mercy. God deals with us not according to law, but love and grace. That the scriptures say he does not treat us as our sins deserve. That he has shown us mercy, and he's not giving us what we earn through works of righteousness. And so on a practical level within marriage, as we grow in our understanding of the love of Christ, we want to reflect that love to each other. This kind of relates to the very first point about putting the Lord first, in that if you want to become a better spouse, then study the love of Christ and pray that it would become real to you. I'm very impressed in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians that after the first 3 chapters, he's describing God's love for us. The Father chose us, the Son redeemed us, the Spirit sealed us. We were dead in sin, God made us alive. All these things God has done for us. At the end of chapter 3, before he comes on to the kind of the practical application of the gospel in chapters 4 to 6, he prays for them that they'd be strengthened inwardly to be able to grasp the height, the length, the breadth, and the depth of the love of Christ for them. And I think the way that fits together is kind of a hinge, is that the only way you're going to be able to do the good things of walking in love and forgiving as you've been forgiven and all of these great the ways we exemplify the new life we have in Christ in chapters 4 to 6 is that you grasp Christ's love for you. And so when Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, is that if a husband is failing to love his wife, the answer isn't just to give him some disciplines of flower buying and helping around the house and gift giving. The key for him is if he understands the love of Christ, and the more the height, the length, the breadth, the depth is in his own heart, and he just marvels at God's love for him in Christ, that's what's going to enable him to reflect that love towards his wife. And then, of course, vice versa. And for me, I think a wonderful goal in marriage, and my desire would be that when Caroline sees how I treat her, that she would have some idea this must be how the Lord loves me. And I can say honestly that that's how I feel she treats me. And the way it's most evident is when I least deserve it, and she's still kind and gracious to me. And so, again, the world says, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. The world says, I will give you what we deserve. God gave us much better than we deserve. And then within marriage, we want to, as we grow in understanding the love of Christ, we connect our lives and our marriages to that love, then we're able to walk in love and show grace. So, I guess I'll do a review before the questions. So there's 6 L's for keys to preserving and strengthening your marriage. The Lord comes first. Laziness is like the weeds in the garden. Lies can be like a cancer. Lust is like a bomb going off. Lift one another up, and the power of affirmation. And then love, not law, meaning we have marriages which are founded by grace and not performance. So that's my summary of some of the most important things I've learned in marriage counseling and things that I would want people who are approaching marriage